Thank you. Thank you all. Very good to be with the Benson Center. I'm delighted to be here at an institution dedicated to the study of Western civilization. I think that it is a topic that needs to be looked at more for reasons that I think will be clearer as I go on. This is certainly a moment to be discussing the topic of anti-Semitism in Western civilization. Either earlier today or perhaps tomorrow, President Trump will be signing an executive order very pertinent to the topic of today's discussion. We can discuss that with specificity if you care to, but in a sense, all of what I have to say is about it. Let me start in 2016. With something that I've been wrestling with lately. In 2016, there was an academic volume on anti-Semitism in North America, in which arguably the leading scholar of North American anti-Semitism, the late Leonard Dinnerstein, contributed an article. In it, he surveyed this study to which he had dedicated his life's work, and he assessed it in a way that I found to be surprising, somewhat dismaying. He said, and I quote, anti-Semitism in the United States, he said, quote, most American Jews don't see it, feel it, fear it. So this was in 2016. To Dinnerstein and others, the reason that Jewish Americans did not see it, feel it, or fear it in 2016 is that it was not there. In other words, he argued that Americans were right to ignore the threat. Quote, what the future may bring is impossible to know, but what might be said about the climate of bigotry in the United States is that anti-Semitism is too minor an issue to think about. Now, that chapter, when I read it in manuscript, was especially dismaying because I knew there was another chapter in the same book that argued the opposite. And embarrassingly, it was by me. And I thought, oh my God, the dean of this field in the same chapter is refuting what I'm saying. I wrote that the forces of anti-Semitism on college campuses were staging the return of anti-Semitism. And I thought, who am I to say that? I mean, I had been working on anti-Semitism issues for a dozen years, so there's a reason why I was writing for this volume. But I had to ask why it was that so many people that I encountered in the Jewish community would ask me why I'm speaking about anti-Semitism. They would ask me, aren't there other issues to talk about? Maybe talk about racism and anti-Semitism. I gave talks on anti-Black racism to African-American audiences who didn't ask me why I was addressing that issue. I spoke in Indian country about discrimination against Native Americans, never got that question. But there was this denial within the Jewish community over the certainly first dozen years that I was looking at it that is a little bit hard to remember in the world that was so changed by October 7, 2023. Now in 2025, when I think that there is no question that most Jewish Americans and most Americans, whether Jewish or not, in this day and age do in fact see it, feel it, fear it. Dinnerstein actually wrote that anti-Semitism is too small a problem to worry about. Now, October 7, we have to talk about. And we have to remember it because I think that there's a tendency always to turn the eyes away. So forgive me because I'm going to focus us on it quite sharply for a moment. On the morning of October 7, 2023, Hamas invaded Israel, killing around 1,200 people, wounding more than 3,300, and taking approximately 240 hostages. During this attack, Hamas terrorists dismembered Jewish bodies, chopping arms and feet off, beheading children and other victims. They shot some dead, parents and children together, and incinerated others alive. Numerous female victims, including children, teenagers, and the elderly, showed signs of sexual abuse. Many were found naked or partially naked, their pelvic bones broken, or with severely mutilated genitals. One Jewish baby was incinerated alive in an oven. International responses varied, some expressing horror, but others celebrated Hamas, quote-unquote, resistance activities, castigating Israel for bringing these atrocities upon its own people or fabricating them. Pro-Hamas rallies were held in many cities, including New York, London, and Rotterdam. In New York, protesters chanted 700, the confirmed number of Israeli fatalities in the attack at that point, while making throat-slitting gestures. In the weeks following October 7, according to the Anti-Defamation League, and by the way, some of this preceded Israel's encroachment into Gaza, and therefore was certainly not a response, at least initially, to any actual or perceived IDF activity at that time. In the weeks after that, anti-Semitic incidents exploded. The Anti-Defamation League recorded nearly 400% increase in the United States. I will say that in the year preceding October 7, we at the Louis D. Brandeis Center faced historic levels of anti-Semitic intake, so great that it's possible that it was greater than all prior years put together. We forget, but the fact is that on October 6, 2023, my staff was tired. They'd been working around the clock. We're thinly staffed despite the fact that we had expanded to deal with what we thought was an extraordinary problem in the year up to October 6. But within just a few weeks after October 7, we were facing a level of intake that was as great as the prior record-breaking year put together. At Harvard University, 31 student societies signed a joint letter on October 9 holding Israel entirely responsible for all violence. A Columbia University professor praised Hamas's attack as awesome and a stunning victory. A Cornell professor enthused that the Hamas pogrom was energizing and got applause when he said that he was exhilarated. Called to testify before Congress, the presidents of 3 prominent universities were unable to state whether calls for the genocide of the Jewish people were consistent with their institution's code of conduct, indicating in response to questioning that it would depend on context. At Columbia University, and this is especially pertinent to today in this place, a coalition representing 116 student groups set up encampments, stormed Hamilton Hall, and announced, quote, "We are Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization." The announcement, perhaps stunning, makes sense. In one respect, maybe they got it, because they were not just protesting against one country. In choosing Hamas over Israel, choosing terror over a democracy, they were in fact rejecting basic principles, not just of that one country or of the United States, but of Western civilization more broadly. One might wonder, in a dark moment, how one can continue basic institutions of Western civilization, the rule of law, democracy, etc., with a generation in which students at some of our top institutions are able to express such views at such a time. In a darker moment still, one might note an irony. Those protesters are themselves, as they acknowledged, products and beneficiaries of Western culture. But it's not just in that they were studying at an institution that is at the pinnacle of Western higher learning, representing, among other things, the scientific approach that has developed in the West and out of the Enlightenment, but also in that some of their articulations were nothing if not deeply modern and Western. And they were products of Western civilization in another respect that candor requires that we acknowledge. The leading study of anti-Semitism in recent years, the University of Chicago historian David Nirenberg's pointedly titled volume, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, demonstrates at considerable length that this long prejudice, anti-Semitism, while it has ancient roots, nevertheless is deeply embedded within the West. Even where one finds it in non-Western cultures, it isn't necessarily indigenous there, but is in fact rooted in Europe and European culture. Nirenberg argues that anti-Semitism was not just a way of thinking about Jews, but rather one of the basic tools with which vast edifices of Western thought are built. That is to say, the conspiratorial worldview of anti-Semitism becomes not just a distorted or stereotypical or defamatory way of looking at a particular despised people, but rather a way of making sense of an entire world that can otherwise be fraught with difficulty, with perhaps traumas that one would prefer not to address oneself, but rather scapegoat another people. When there is an ideology which sees a single people as responsible for all of the world's wars, certainly from the French Revolution through First World War to the present, as indicated in the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other literature circulating among many anti-Semitic groups, we have here a worldview that has become an all-encompassing approach, and one which is rooted very much in the West. And it might be even a little worse than that. It is not the case that the lethal form of anti-Semitism that gave rise to the Nazi genocide preceded the Enlightenment, although it certainly had precursors prior to the Enlightenment. In a very real sense, the modern ideology of anti-Semitism began at the time of the Enlightenment, and in fact, as a response to much of the Enlightenment. That is to say, it was only with Jewish emancipation, that is to say, the removal of certain legal disabilities of Jews and assimilation of Jews into European cultures, that two distinct patterns emerged that we would see again through the centuries, including today. One is what we now call erasive anti-Semitism. In France and elsewhere at the time of their revolution, there was a notion that all should be given to Jews who become citizens and assimilate into French or European culture, but nothing to Jewish communities per se. That is to say, for those who hold on to the specific identity of the Jewish people, there would not be a place in these European cultures. That is the erasive aspect of anti-Semitism, which again you might recognize when you think about some aspects of today's news. The other aspect, though, was the exclusionary anti-Semitism, for those who resented the success of those Jews who made use of their new freedoms by integrating into society, intermarrying, and becoming successful within European cultures. Often Jews were resented not just for their own success, but also for all of the dislocations of modernity with which they became collectively associated. We could say the joke is on the protesters, that their very efforts to fight Western civilization cannot help but rely upon its resources, but the joke might also be on us when our efforts to save Western civilization from the greatest evils with which it is faced we cannot resist the conclusion that those evils too are a product of our Western civilization. In the face of October 7, many began to claim that the century of Jewish American progress had ended. Some feared that Jews would need to retreat from secular American institutions, forsaking elite institutions that had become havens for anti-Semitism, forsaking the West in general, retreating perhaps to Israel not just as a safe location, but as a way of turning one's back against Western culture. Some asked whether the entire Western project and American nation had become untenable, questioning whether emigration to Israel was necessary. They questioned in some cases whether the Jewish American project, perhaps even the Western Enlightenment project more generally, had failed. Journalist Franklin Foer wrote in a widely discussed cover article in The Atlantic called "The Golden Age of America is Ending." He wrote, "The Golden Age had seen an unprecedented period of safety, prosperity, and political influence. But he fretted that this period was coming to a close, that the extraordinary successes of integration that Jewish Americans had achieved during the 20th century had come to an end." Both Dinnerstein's sanguinity and Ford's despair arise from the same error, I will argue. Both assume that Jewish progress is like a light switch that is either switched on or switched off. Dinnerstein could not bring himself to appreciate a problem which, if acknowledged, might have unimaginable consequences. Ford assumes those consequences to be both real and present. In fact, Jewish political successes over the ages have often been on and off, backwards and forward, start and stop, even in the United States. And this is something that I think that I've only started thinking about, even though I've been dealing with the anti-Semitism issues for well over 20 years. Even in the United States, we have sustained lengthy periods of reversal without facing the end of civilization. In fact, it is the norm and not the exception of Jewish civil rights advances to be followed by periods of retrenchment, which can then be followed by additional advances. Yale University professor David Sorkin has written fairly recently what I think is an extraordinary work on Jewish emancipation. I think some people find even the term unusual, associating the term emancipation with other things, such as African American history or minors or women, but the term has been used for a couple centuries to describe the processes by which Jews, once denied basic civil and human rights, were granted them over time. Sorkin makes the point that this is a process that has unfolded over time, at different times and in different places. It started and stopped. It has begun, it has moved forward, and then it has ruptured with periods of reversal, only to move forward again. I believe that some people who are in despair over this anti-Semitism think, oh my God, things were so good for so long, but now we're turning the other way, and we are headed in a direction which can only go ineluctably to a particular place. But that is not how history has unfolded for the Jewish people elsewhere or in the United States. And thinking about it might provide us a way of thinking better about the prospects for fighting back against anti-Semitism and for thinking about what can be achieved in the United States and throughout the West, and how and why. The central but unseen fact of Jewish American legal history is that it has seen two cycles of emancipation. Here I'm indebted to Sorkin, but will go beyond him in ways that I don't know if he would agree with or not. The cycles correspond roughly with histories of American anti-Semitism, tolerance, assimilation, and reaction. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman had once observed that there are few, if any, straight roads in modern Jewish history, and that has been true here as well. I'm going to tell the history a little bit, but I want to start before Enlightenment and before emancipation, since I have pointed out that with emancipation we saw the rise of a uniquely genocidal anti-Semitism. We have to point out what preceded it, because there are some who romanticize Jewish communal life during the long Middle Ages, a period in many countries and many periods that you don't want to oversimplify, but where there was in fact great persecution of the Jewish people. Since we're in a law school, and I'm a lawyer, I'll focus on a couple of legal issues. Start with the Magna Carta. Do we have lawyers in the room? Good, I can make stuff up. Oh, don't tell them. The Magna Carta is arguably the second most prestigious document in American law after the Constitution. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor discussed how, as justices, they would walk in through doors that had the Magna Carta on it, and while at the bench would look out at an image of King John the lawmaker. This core document from the 13th century in England is considered a basis of much of American law, including certainly the notion of due process. But for Jews, it's maybe a little different. Jews are actually mentioned in the Magna Carta. Don't think that's a good thing. But not for the due process we're given, but rather for the protections against the Jewish people, which is to say the nobles who rose up against King John and were insisting upon certain privileges that would later be a basis for English law, wanted to make sure that they and their widows and children would have protection against usurious Jews and those who would succeed in interest to the debts that they had to Jews. So even in a very basic English document that became a core component of American law, Jews appear not as a recipient of rights and privileges, but as the group against whom they were needed. And this is also somewhat representative of much of what we see from that period. Jews were in England at least since approximately the period of the Norman invasion, and their legal status is discussed in major legal scholarship for centuries after Jews were expelled from England, and it was therefore rather irrelevant what the status of Jews might be. For Jews in England, there were no rights against the king. The king responded to Jews as a collective group. There were courts for Jews. But Jews were protected from other groups of people as well. That was, in some respect, a source of resentment because Jews had, they believed, special privileges that other groups didn't have, including during certain periods the right to charge interest on loans, which was denied to Christians during much of the period when Jews lived in England during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. But to say Jews had any rights at all during this period is to ignore that they were in fact compared by an English king to the king's dog. You couldn't kick the king's dog without facing severe punishment because it was the king's dog. But the king could do anything to the dog. And the reason that Jews were mentioned afterwards in English law is that Jews were the paradigmatic example of a group of people who have no rights against the sovereign as contrasted to the English people generally. This was in 1215 with the Magna Carta, but within decades, the Jewish people of England would be so severely crippled and destroyed that it was a bare remnant of them that was then thrown out of the country altogether. In the United States, the story is different, but maybe not as favorable as we sometimes like to think. When Jews first arrived as a group to settle in what would become New York, then New Amsterdam, the then Governor Peter Stuyvesant tried to push them away. They were not initially allowed until his request was overturned by the board of the East Indies Company. And then when Stuyvesant was required to let Jews settle, it was certainly not on equal terms, not with the right to vote, for instance, not even the right to serve guard, but instead were charged for those services. And in fact, throughout the colonies, there were any number of different rights, voting, office holding, and the like, that were at various points denied to Jews, although in fairness, other groups as well. Some argue that Jews did not have an emancipation in the United States, except in the sense that every Jew who arrived in Ellis Island was emancipated as compared to what they faced in Europe. But the fact is that with the Constitution, and the guarantee that there would be no religious test for office. And with the extraordinary changes in state constitutions and state laws in the period that followed, there was a dramatic expansion in the rights of the Jewish people. There was a period from roughly the Revolutionary War, or the establishment perhaps of the Constitution, until the end of the Civil War, when Jews had, generally speaking, a continual improvement of rights through changes in constitutions. Now, during that period, you can find examples of discrimination against Jews. You can find all sorts of indication that Jews did not have equal rights. And yet there was, generally speaking, a continual improvement. And I mention that because it stopped. It stopped. Now, I have to say, I had heard for years growing up stories about country clubs that didn't admit Jews, about professions that were closed to Jews. I don't think I realized that that's not the way it had always been. That it was really in the late 1800s that some people who had been going to hotels and resorts for years, who had been members of country clubs, suddenly were told that they were not welcome. That this so-called social anti-Semitism, beginning at about the same time as the modern anti-Semitism was developed in Germany, beginning at about the same time as the Jim Crow laws in the United States. This was something new and worse in the United States. That is to say, the American Jewish experience saw bad times, saw significant periods of improvement, which must have appeared like a great golden age as compared to what happened before, and then saw a period where things got very dramatically worse, to the point where whole professions were largely closed to Jews, where Jews were not able to get positions in law firms, where highly selective universities, in some cases had quotas, and in other cases developed in entire systems in order to limit the enrollment of Jewish students. Medical schools would limit student applicants, but if one became a doctor, one wouldn't necessarily be able to get privileges at medical hospitals, and so on and so forth. In other words, exclusionary anti-Semitism followed a period of progress with a period of retrenchment that lasted until roughly the end of the Second World War. During that period, anti-Jewish attitudes increased rather shockingly, and any number of different policies were adopted based in part on negative attitudes towards Jews, including, for example, restrictive immigration laws, which admittedly were based in part on xenophobia and negative attitudes towards other groups, but not in small measure with respect also to anti-Semitism. So my point is that we have had a first Jewish emancipation. We have had a first entrenchment. And then we had a second emancipation. That is to say, for the period from the end of the Second World War until roughly the onset of the Second Intifada, Jews in America made such steady and substantial and extraordinary progress that it was hard for many people to believe that things could change. It seemed like it would last forever. Civil rights laws were passed, not specific to Jews, but in part based on the advocacy of the Jewish people. Institutions that restricted Jews would start to allow them again. Racially restrictive covenants that prevented Jews from owning property in whole neighborhoods, large swaths of America were closed, certainly among the most desirable areas. That went by the wayside. And suddenly, enrollment in Ivy League and other highly selective institutions skyrocketed. Jews became prominent in every field, it seems, in which they had previously been rejected, to the point where it became possible near the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century to believe that while anti-Semitism hadn't been fully extinguished, it was not something to worry about anymore, and it was possible to believe that even if you were a serious scholar of history. And around the time of the onset of the Second Intifada, around late 2001, 2002, I started following it, in part because I was at the time a young civil rights enforcement official, and I was thinking about ways to address post 9/11 discrimination. At HUD, I actually developed a policy approach to try to help people who might face discrimination in housing or mortgage lending based on post 9/11 situations. But that policy in my first draft was about Arabs and Muslims and people from southern Asia and the Middle East. And it didn't occur to me to include Jews until someone else pointed it out. I knew about anti-Semitism. I'm Jewish. I'd faced some anti-Semitism. But when I thought about post 9/11 anti-Semitism, and this was before I started reading about the 9/11 conspiracy theory, I thought, we've got to find ways of helping Arab and Muslim Americans. By 2002, I was reading, and at this point I was at the Department of Education, I was reading not just about some discrimination against Arab and Sikh and Muslim students, but also I was seeing at San Francisco State University, there was an incident that I looked at and I thought, this is really strange. There was a flyer, and forgive me, I'm going to be explicit, there was a flyer that circulated at this Northern California campus that had an image of a soup can with a picture of a dead baby and the words along the lines of dead Palestinian baby meat, slaughtered by Jewish Rite, R-I-T-E, under American license. I'm going to confess, I didn't know what the blood libel was back then. I knew that this was something extraordinary. I didn't know back then that from medieval England, Jews had been accused of ceremonial murder of Gentile babies and using their blood for ceremonial purposes, and that whenever this blood libel accusation would circulate in a village, often Jews would be murdered, sometimes whole communities would be slaughtered. But here in California in the 21st century was an explicit use of the blood libel, which was at the same time undeniably political speech, in the sense that it was making a statement both about Israeli policy and about American policy. I didn't think I could reject the notion that it was expressing an idea, and yet it was clearly very deeply bigoted. I saw this, and then within a few weeks, there was what some described as a riot on that campus. No one was killed. Police had to rush the Jewish students, faculty, and community members away from the riot to the safety of the local Hillel building. Much in the same way that this sort of blood libel had caused attacks on Jews in the past. And I thought, my God, is this just an incident? Or is this something that might be a sign of matters to come? And then I started hearing about problems at the University of California, Irvine campus. And I realized this looks different. We've had over half a century of progress against this old hate. Is this just an incident or something else happening? As I heard more and more incidents, I spoke to my staff. I said, if anybody comes to you anywhere in the United States and says, I have a problem about religion, any religion, call headquarters. And they did. A man in New Jersey comes into the New York office and says, my son was beaten up and called Osama because of our faith and his headdress. Now, at the time, my agency, OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the agency that protects students' civil rights, Some of you might be students, so you might want to remember. OCR, protected against discrimination based on race, color, national origin, age, sex, disability, and would add patriotic youth organizations like Little League Baseball and the Boy Scouts of America, but did not include religion. And I had assumed that that was an omission by the webmaster, but no, it was Congress. We can talk about that. But what I said is, you know what, we don't have jurisdiction based on faith. But it seems to me that some discrimination against ethno-religious groups has more than just a faith component to it. And we don't know whether this father, who used the term faith, was accurately making a legal conclusion, which is our responsibility, because calling someone Osama isn't necessarily a reference to the tenets of theology. It could be lots of different things. It could be based on Sikh religion. It could be based on perceived Muslim or Arab. It could be based on some stereotypical incorrect notion of what it means to be Sikh. And Sikhism, while clearly a world religion, also has certain ethnic or ancestral characteristics, like origination in the same part of the world, common language, garb, foods, so on and so forth. It may well be that this is a group that can be protected under the race and national origin. And yes, I was aware at that time that everything I was saying about Sikhs could also be said about Jews. Based on this, I developed a policy under which members of ethno-religious groups have the same federal protections as Jews. A policy that I developed informally 20 years ago that was elevated to the level of an executive order in 2019, and which is apparently reaffirmed in an executive order that either was signed today or is about to be signed tomorrow. When I wrote in this 2016 piece about the need to address anti-Semitism, I was thinking about things like lawsuits. And in fact, I've spent the last several years representing Jewish students, Jewish families, other Jewish groups in legal action responding to incidents of anti-Semitism. I had in mind things like certain policies, like the policy that I just described, embodied in an executive order, and now perhaps a second executive order today or tomorrow. I had in mind laws like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which leaders of both chambers of commerce have said would be reintroduced in this Congress. I had in mind a host of different ways of responding to particular incidents of anti-Semitism, and perhaps even developing national policies that would get ahead of the problem. And in fact, that's what I've spent much of the last several years doing, and more needs to be done. The amount of work and the extent of the problem has exploded since October 7, after, as I've described, a historic year before that. But then there's the question of what's beneath this. Is it really just a matter of dealing with particular incidents? How is it that some of this can be the work of highly educated students at great institutions, graduates of great institutions, people whom you would think should know better? Is it enough simply to deal with the incidents as they arise, or to come up with systemic approaches to deal with them? Surely there is some connection between these incidents and the extraordinarily complex and sometimes resource-intensive approaches that many of these same institutions have developed in response to all sorts of hate or bias incidents. The whole machineries in which institutions address hate or bias incidents, diversity, inclusion issues, but often omit in their programming any reference to Jews or anti-Semitism, sometimes insisting that they address in their programming only marginalized and disadvantaged groups, of which Jews, they believe, are not one. It is not just a matter of whether Jews are included or not included, which one could solve by simply adding Jews to the system. It's also a question of whether the structure itself is harmful. So, for instance, if you have an approach to these subjects that insists on a binary opposition between the oppressor and the oppressed, it shouldn't be surprising when Jews are then assumed to be the oppressor, because after all, it's insisted upon that Jews are white. We've had clients that they're told they can't deny that they're white, even if they're Hispanic or otherwise identify as people of color. But what if they're Ashkenazic and light-skinned? Do we insist that they are white? And what does it matter if they're white or not? But how is it that Jews historically were considered non-white when being white was how you got privilege? How is it that white supremacists view Jews as being non-white, but that others will view Jews as being not just white, but hyper-white? So that Jews are told to own their privilege with this notion that Jews are, at best, simply white, but at worst, are a particular white adjacent or hyper-white group that needs to own Jewish privilege because Jewish privilege is associated with wealth, power, success, in a way that often slides too rapidly into traditional conspiratorial notions of what it means to be Jewish, at exactly the institutions that are intended to deal with the hate and bias, which is therefore engendered. But below this, there is the question. Below the programs, whether administratively or in curricula, there's the question of how does this arise? How have we lost, what is this void that these are filling? And what is the loss of confidence in notions of equality, of privileges and immunity, of liberal notions of justice, of Western civilization, which had once been very tightly embraced, but which now are controversial. And where now these groups at Columbia, unsurprisingly, are seeking to eradicate. I won't deny that the issue is complicated, because if we say that a part of the solution has to be to drill deeper, not just to respond reactively to incidents, not just to develop systemic approaches for those incidents, not just to look even at the underlying ideologies, but also to look at the vacuum, at the loss of confidence in basic values that through which we'd resisted them, we have to realize in candor that those basic institutions, those basic values, always had an edge to them. There was always a certain amount of Jew hatred central to much of Western thinking, even and perhaps in particular during the Enlightened period, which we associate with values like tolerance and reason and science and democracy. When we think about it that way, it seems to me that there are a few important lessons. One is we needn't despair that as bad as things have gotten, we can admit we are in a retrenchment. But this period of retrenchment, we might have just opened our eyes on October 7, 2023, but by my count, we're nearly a quarter century into it. That is to say, the long second period of emancipation has been over since 9/11. Since then, I don't think it is sustainable to argue that we have continued to make progress. Things were getting worse, but imperceptibly and now perceptibly. We're a quarter century into a retrenchment, which means that it is now possible for us to think not just of fighting back, but of whether the second emancipation can be followed by a third. That is to say, think not just about fighting back. Even in periods of retrenchment, it's possible to make victories. There were victories against anti-Semitism during the period of the second retrenchment. There were state laws, there were other things that were done, court victories during the period that I described. but things were going in the wrong direction. We need to think about a change that is as substantial now as during the first two. And we need to realize that it's possible. It's possible not just to halt the direction we've been in, not just to reverse it, but to seek a change that is as profound as the two that we have seen in our history. But it has to be one that is based on the same values that led to both the first and the second. And it has to be done in a way that resists both the erasive and the exclusionary aspects of the anti-Semitism, which were part and parcel of the Enlightenment project in the past. To me, that is the ultimate project, and it is why we need both to continue to fight back, to stand our ground, not to give up our institutions in the way that some magazines have encouraged recently, but also to say that the goal isn't just incidental victories, it isn't just policies, it is a change so profound that requires not just lawyers like myself, but also institutions like the Benson Center. And for that, I thank you.
Thank you. For Q&A, we have both a virtual audience as well as the live audience. I have questions from the virtual audience. Anyone watching on our live stream, you can ask a question using the Q&A function, and I'll go back and forth between questions from here and virtual questions. But I'll use my prerogative first to ask the first question. I'm guessing that you are familiar with David Bernstein's book, Classified, about the history of legal racial classifications in the United States. And Bernstein argues, as I understand him, that Jews have always been classified legally as white. And it seems to me, I mean, he's the expert on this subject, not me, but it seems to me that even if he's right there, that he misses, that there's something that's being left out here. And I wonder how you'd respond to this. It seems to me, socially speaking, if not legally speaking, that for the groups who think that there's something particularly good about being white, Jews have typically been considered non-white. Whereas for the groups that think that there's something particularly bad, sinful, about being white, then Jews are considered white.
Yes.
What do you think about that about the dialogue?
No, I think that's right. I think that David Bernstein's book on Classified is important as scholarship, and it demonstrates the arbitrary quality of governmental classifications that we tend to think of as being natural and unavoidable, but in fact we have a history that doesn't run back that long. Categories like white, black, Asian, they've not been around forever. They've changed. They have a politics and a history, and we will move to something else at some point. There is a literature, more historical or sociological literature, on how the Jews became white, quote unquote. There's a book of that name. Eric Goldstein has a book on the price of whiteness, which I think is a solid historical book. I have a book on Jewish identity and civil rights in America, which describes various ways of looking at the changing perceptions of Jewish racial identity and why that matters legally. The historical books do show that in different periods Jews were actually perceived as Asian, or as was then said, Oriental. And not only described in that way, but seen differently, or sometimes were seen as black or colored or something of that sort. And there are books like Melvin Connor's Anthropology of Jews that talk about the different perceptions of different aspects of Jewish physiognomy, the nose, the forehead, more aspects than you could possibly imagine. It's really horrendous. And how Jews have actually been perceived differently. You know, there are some periods in which people think that Jews have big noses, and other historical periods where they don't notice it or don't talk about it. But there's a history of a particular perception of whether Jewish features are really different and what Jews look like and whether Jews should be considered white or not. Bernstein is talking about particular legal categories for particular departments, and it's true in those contexts. In the census and otherwise, Jews at various points were considered Hebrews as a race. So that's changed somewhat. And then there are some federal legal structures where there isn't a need for classification. So for instance, at OCR, this race, color, national origin, it almost doesn't matter whether Jews are classified as this or that. The question is whether there's discrimination based on a actual or perceived racial difference. Okay. Sure.
How much of what we've seen on campuses since October 7th is anti-Semitism versus, I tend to think of it more as anti-Westernism, and that Jews in Israel are just coded as Western and sort of caught in the crossfire of that sort of conflict which has been going on campus for 20 years.
Yeah. It's surprising historically how often the hatred of Jews has been part of a broader drama. So for instance, I mentioned the Magna Carta earlier. Some scholars will say, well, it wasn't anti-Semitism driving it. It was animosity against King John, and Jews were associated with the king, and so it was partly because of attitudes towards the king that Jews faced persecution. And that happened all throughout Europe for long periods of time, that those who resisted the sovereign would resist the Jews. It's also happened in other historic periods where Jews had to find some shelter with some powerful institution, and then were hated because of it. But in the end, either way, it has fed into not just negative actions towards Jews, but the buildup of this conspiratorial worldview, the buildup of this hatred. You have a point that often what we see in recent years of anti-Jewish attitudes is connected with anti-American, anti-Western, and the like. To be clear, we have anti-Jewish hatred at both extremes. Right, so we have right-wing anti-Semitism, which operates very differently, although at the end of the day, they're both forms of Jew hatred. I don't think it is coincidental that so often anti-Jewish attitudes on the left are connected with anti-American or anti-Western attitudes as well. It's part and parcel of an ideology.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. So, been enjoying a very intellectual analysis of anti-Semitism, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I'm a person with a high school diploma, okay? But I'm a Christian, and so I have a biblical worldview. And so when you look at the Jewish people, from my perspective, they're God's chosen people. And so, over the time since going back to Abraham, or more specifically Moses, the persecution of the Jews has just been a part of their history, and it's rooted in the forces of good and evil. And another aspect that really kind of highlights how just exclusive these people are, Jewish people, is you look at the disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes they get for sciences compared to every other people group in the entire world. It's just, and there's such an infinitesimal number of people from a population perspective compared to other groups. So I just wanted to just ask you, I mean, coming from your perspective as a Jewish man, what are your perspectives on that thought?
I appreciate your sharing it. I have to say that when you referred to my talk as intellectual at the beginning, I was very nervous about that.
Okay.
But I appreciate your kind words.
Do you have anything to share about that person?
About the percentage of Jews who have received
just the fact that it's the Jewish people are more beyond what we even understand. If you have a biblical worldview, you understand what I mean when I call them God's chosen people. They are unique beyond any other people group in the entire world for that very specific reason. I just thought if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, there's the religious aspect of what you're saying, but there's also the aspect of Jewish success. So let me say a word about Jewish success. I think that it is it's a mistake to suggest that anything that Jews are doing is responsible for anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, Jewish success often is part of the context of the hatred that Jews face. I'm not going to say that that's unique. There are some other groups in different parts of the world who are despised for their success and who face persecution not as a perceived lower group, but as a hated, wealthy, successful group. So it's not unique. It's a little unusual, though. So this form of prejudice operates very differently than those forms of discrimination against groups who are viewed by racists as being inferior. It's a different kind of prejudice. It sort of ties in with resentment, and it also ties in with this notion that there must be something sinister, or there must be doing something. So I think that it is definitely closely related to the nature of the discrimination that the Jewish people face.
Thank you.
Here's a question from the virtual audience. How do you suppose that the curbing of DEI efforts will affect anti-Semitism?
That's a great question. I have to start by saying that there's something unusual about the DEI discussion. You might have observed it, but it sort of clicked with me. I was giving testimony before Congress last year, and I was critical of DEI, and there was another witness who was supportive of it. And the members of Congress on the panel were split along predictable party lines in it. But I realized that it was an unusual discussion because the phenomenon that DEI supporters were supporting is very different than what the critics were opposing. They were talking about two different things. You could have a debate over the marginal income tax rates or the minimum wage, where you and your adversary are talking about the same thing. You just have different views about what it should be. But it clicked when I heard the other witness talking about how you need to understand that DEI has been around for decades. And I thought, no, it hasn't. DEI might have become such a comprehensive orthodoxy so fast that we feel that it did. It was a dozen years ago that I was teaching a course on diversity management, which at the time was the voguish approach to anti-discrimination issues, and DEI wasn't around yet. If one is supporting something that they call DEI, which has been around for decades, it means you're talking about something much broader that might include a whole cluster of different approaches to discrimination, to harassment, or even assault, to disability issue. There are all sorts of things that people talk about when they support DEI. But the opposition to DEI is about a much more historically specific phenomenon that really became popular just a few years ago, and that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd became extraordinarily widespread. And that DEI is an approach based on a particular ideology that I was referring to earlier, although not by name. It is a notion of oppressor and oppressed, of these dichotomies, oftentimes connected with different sorts of preferences or ideas about hiring, right? So that's the DEI that poses challenges for the Jewish community in different respects, sometimes by excluding Jews, sometimes by fostering inadvertently stereotypical thinking, sometimes by diminishing notions of merit that have undergirded Jewish success, but in a way that leads to sharp reductions in Jewish involvement. So the DEI that is a much more recent, narrow that has its complications.
Hi, thank you very much, first of all. A term we've been seeing recently since October 7th is people define their acts as not anti-Semitic but anti-Zionist. How do you approach these being compared to acts of anti-Semitism? People define their acts as anti-Zionist.
Yeah. The term anti-Zionist has meant different things at different periods. So prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, it was certainly quite possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. Many Jews were. There were different arguments for what the appropriate response was to anti-Semitism in Europe. Some were pro or con the establishment of a Jewish state. There are still to this day some people who oppose the established State of Israel because they think that the Messiah should come before we have a State of Israel. That's not my view, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic either. It has become very difficult, I believe, to oppose Zionism without adopting a kind of a position which is anti-Semitic as well. I spoke earlier of these two responses to Enlightenment, of erasive and exclusionary. The English legal academic David Seymour has an interesting article in which he discusses how, with the establishment of the State of Israel, there has been a displacement of that process, so that there is now an erasive anti-Zionism and an exclusionary anti-Zionism, which is to say the same processes that had been used against Jews as individuals are now projected onto the collective Jew, Israel as the so-called Jew among nations. So that on the one hand, those Jews, which is a great majority in the United States, those Jews for whom Zionism is integral to Jewish identity, are excluded, oftentimes shunned, marginalized. We have cases in which there are rules against Zionists. Rule against Zionists is rule against Jews. When student groups say that we will never permit Zionists to address us, it's true that there are Jews who aren't Zionists. It's true that there are Zionists who are not Jews. But everyone should understand that that's a rule against Jews. In the same way that if you had a rule against people who support the Pope, there are people who like the Pope who aren't Catholic. There are people who are Catholic who might have different views. But if a group said we don't want any member who supports the Pope, everyone would understand that they were anti-Catholic and that this is bigotry. It's the same with anti-Semitism. Again, there are people with different views about the State of Israel. And yet, those who respond to Israel by shunning Zionists, it's a shunning of Jews. Just last week, in settlement of a lawsuit from the Louis D. Brandeis Center, Harvard University agreed to adopt in its anti-discrimination approach a statement about how various forms of exclusion of Zionists should be treated the same as exclusion of Jews. New York University had made a somewhat similar statement recently, acknowledging that Zionist is often a code word for Jew. I think that institutions are slowly, and sometimes at threat of lawsuit, acknowledging that what goes by the name of anti-Zionism is often just another coding for an exclusion of Jews.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and for your work with students as well. When I look at this problem or issue, and you've mentioned it, it's throughout much of human history. You only have to pick up Martin Luther, and the way he discusses Jews is that they're evil beyond belief, and so you move through time. I think in the last 20 years, as you discussed the universities in particular, I think many Jews, including myself, were shocked that the left, we always knew about the Pat Buchanans and the various radio preachers that were anti-Semitic. But I think when the left went that way, given Jewish history with the civil rights movement, all of us were stunned and shocked that this would come at us. What I'm asking you is, isn't this something that's just going to be part of the picture and it will come and go as various elements play out, and that perhaps there's nothing that can be done to force people to love or even tolerate Jews?
It is interesting that there are many people who have had the observation, the left is now a source of anti-Semitism. How could that be when the left is so closely tied to civil rights and anti-discrimination and tolerance and all of that? But this isn't new. The late historian Robert Wistrich wrote a history book on left-wing anti-Semitism. And it's thick. And it's not just about the last few decades. It goes back, and it turns out there is a long and dark history of anti-Semitism on the left, just as there is on the right. This unfortunately may reinforce and not undermine the point that I think you're trying to make, which is that it's almost inconceivable that anytime soon, in any our generation or any generations that we can envision, this cultural backdrop of anti-Semitism is going to disappear. Even during periods of general philo-Semitism, even during periods of Jewish emancipation, golden ages of the Jewish people, which I've just argued we're no longer in, but some of us remember, some of us were born in one, but it's not one now. But even then, if you were looking to scapegoat a people, there were culturally available stereotypes and defamations of Jews. It didn't go away. There were still incidents. There were still groups. It was small, but the embers are going to be there. Right now, we've got flames. I think we can aim for a point where there are embers, even with the acknowledgement that beyond just saying we're going to fight back against anti-Semitism, beyond suggesting, as I've suggested, that we should seek a sort of a broader emancipatory period, we have to acknowledge that even then there's going to be this backdrop. And that what that means is then in the golden ages, people need to be vigilant because it can come back. I think that in America it was all too easy to drop one's guard. And there were organizations that had been established to address anti-Semitism. I don't mean to speak negatively in particular, but there were organizations that was their goal, that thought, well, now we can do other work because anti-Semitism isn't a problem. Well, anti-Semitism was still a problem. It was just sort of low. So I think that the goal really won't be anytime soon to eliminate it, but just get it back to the embers.
There's actually a bit of a follow-up question from the virtual audience, though obviously it's not literally a follow-up, but do you think the ADL has learned anything from the Queers for Palestine movement?
Well, since you say that it was a follow-up, I have to say that I work with the Anti-Defamation League, and I think Jonathan Greenblatt lately has been doing some great work, and so I'm very pleased by that partnership. It's not always the case that people who support me would support them, or the other way around, but I've been pleased by their partnership. I couldn't speak to what they've learned from or not learned from.
Yes.
In the call for the demise of Western civilization, and on the other side, ideals of Western civilization that haven't yet brought about the fullness of human flourishing, do they have different or similar views on religious pluriformity? Is one more about the demise of religion as an entity and whether it's practice or ethnicity. If my question is, if there's a connection that's deep at the heart of Western civilization that has to do with anti-Semitism, and I really appreciate your presentation, then we should all be calling for that demise. What situation will allow the flourishing, will allow dignified human flourishing that is a new substitute or a new move forward for Western civilization? Does that make sense? How do we get better? Maybe is the better way to ask that.
I think so. So, so I think the question is about approaches that clear a space for different forms of human flourishing, especially of a spiritual dimension. During the early period of Jewish emancipation, there were in some countries a sort of a secular approach that was anti-religion. So there was a French history. There were in some places it was together with like a xenophobia, so or a kind of a sectarian approach that favored some religions over the other. The challenge is to find an approach that both permits the expression of distinct identity. In other words, that isn't erasive, but doesn't repel at the same time. Now, I believe that there are challenges to the salad approach, right? There's the notion of the melting pot, and then there's the notion of, well, we don't want to melt everybody into an undifferentiated unity. We want to respect differences. We want a salad instead. So we want to make sure that there can be, each group has their own. The downside to that is the question is, how can you achieve sufficient unity? How can you achieve a love of shared values? How can you cultivate a patriotism that doesn't go into jingoism? Right? So to me, the challenge is getting that balance. Those people who appreciate the need for this sort of diversity of flourishing don't always get the need for the e pluribus unum. Those who appreciate the unity don't always get the need to respect differences.
What generational differences have you noticed in working with students and people like born after, like post this golden age, which you've talked about, and like Jews, like older Jews, like in our community who have lived through that and now are trying to understand how to like live under this new situation?
It sounds like you've thought about it. Have you noticed a difference that?
Well, I was born in 2005, so I couldn't say, but I definitely I like talking to my parents and community members who like, it feels like while we're both experiencing the same thing, we're experiencing it differently in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are lots of differences. Right? People of certain ages might use different social media than others, and those social media create different kinds of bias that I think has generated different approaches and sometimes negative ones. I think that there are often differences even within subgroups. I mean, there's talk about there might be different ways of thinking about politics among people who are in college now that might be different than those who were in college 5 years ago. There might be a generational divide growing. I remember a few years ago, I went to Irvine. I mentioned during my talk that early on I saw issues at the University of California at Irvine. And there were a number of students who had worked to fight anti-Semitism and who were very vocal at Irvine, Jewish students. And I went there and heard none of that from the students I talked to. And it turned out that they thought, well, you know, they're graduates. They're not even here anymore. Those are the older ones. And I'm like, well, they're like 22. I think they're the same generation. But there was this notion, you know, even, well, that's different. That's not us. I don't know. I do have a concern. So on the one hand, I'll start with a negative. I've talked about anti-Semitism on college campuses. In some ways, much more horrific are the problems we're seeing in many K-12 institutions, including especially high schools, and there are all sorts of problems. Some of it is sort of traditional, anti-Semitism. It could be right-wing, it could be whatever, Jews called greedy, throwing pennies at them, that sort of thing. Some of it seems to be high school students doing exactly the same thing that their older siblings did, including the same chants, the same protest, the same whatever. Some of it seems to be driven by school board approved curriculum. Some of it seems to be driven by teachers. There are all sorts of things. The fear that I have is that what that means is that students coming through American, both public and private schools, are going to be arriving at college with different kinds of attitudes than students who are just a little bit older than them, because high schools are different now than they were 5 years ago. And that's not true everywhere, but it's true in a lot of places. So there's definitely some things that I find concerning about some young people, including the ones who are just starting college now or just about to start college. On the other hand, I do see some encouraging things with some young people, including recent college graduates, college students, and high school, which is to say, people respond differently to this anti-Semitism. Some Jewish students we see no longer want to go to Jewish events. Even they don't go to the Shabbat dinner, or they don't want to go to a Jewish lecture, they don't want to wear the Star of David or Jewish identified clothing, the t-shirts that an older sibling might have worn a few years ago, they're not going to wear. They erase their own Jewish identities in some ways, or mute or cover them in various respects. That is a common reaction. But there's another kind of reaction, which is to say we're seeing far more students pushing back than ever before, especially since October 7. We're seeing more students who are developing organizations to fight, who are saying, I want to be active. Sometimes it takes the form of they will make it a point to go to a Shabbat dinner that they might not have thought they would go to 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe it means that they will say, I want to file a lawsuit and I want to be a named plaintiff. Which we might not have heard 2 years ago. So there seems to be changing attitudes as a result of the negatives of the last couple of years, and some of those changing attitudes are, a source for regret, but some of them are, I think, a source for optimism.
Thanks. If I may, I'd like to return to a concept that the gentleman in the front row had brought up earlier. And I think that it's I don't think we can have a thorough understanding conversation about anti-Semitism without maybe a deeper reflection on the religious aspect of that. I think that sort of the observational and procedural and policy information is very, very interesting, but I think that it's just hard to really understand it without looking a little deeper. Why the Jew? Why is the Jew a target, a scapegoat of whatever scourge or ill that given aspect of society throughout millennia have chosen? What is it about the Jew? David Wolpe notes that people hate Jews because they're communists, or capitalists, foreigners, residents, immigrants, elitists, have strange ways, are unassimilated, too assimilated, bankroll the left, bankroll the right. Do they hate Jews because they're weak and stateless, or because they're Zionists and they defend Israel? So there's something. What is it about the Jew and Judaism? I think I'm going to offer a suggestion that does harken back to biblical considerations, because it's a religion. It's a religious aspect here. So the Jews brought to the world, introduced to the world, the concept of a God that has universal moral code for goodness for everyone. It's a judging God, and Jews are chosen to exemplify that concept, that there is a universal moral code, a judging God, and how we live our lives. Everyone should live their lives to be good to one another in light of that consideration. So I'll offer that to the conversation. I think we need to understand there's something about why Jews are targeted throughout the world.
Yeah. Well, let me try a thought, although this is certainly not a question we'll answer here, and people will have different views, and I think that that's fine. The answers to which I have been drawn are those that answer the question in terms of the needs of the anti-Semites as opposed to the reality of the Jews, which is to say that it's not something specific to what Jews are about. It's about what is it about a particular people at a particular time that required a development of scapegoating. By a certain period, there was so much in the way of anti-Semitic attitudes that someone who wanted to find a scapegoat, Jews became the scapegoat. Some of the histories of anti-Semitism, like the Nuremberg volume that I referred to, or perhaps Simon Schama's history, go back to ancient Egypt and to social and political conflicts at the time of the Passover story. They go back to that in a way that isn't necessarily purely religious, although there can be religious elements as well. Some people point to in the early Christian church, and to the notion among some that if Jews had killed not just a prophet but actually God, there must be something demonic about a people who would do that. And for a people who would do something so evil, not just to reject a savior in their midst, but to kill, there must be something that is beyond simply unpleasant. Over the years, whether starting in Egypt, whether starting in elsewhere in the Middle East, there developed so much that it seems that all sorts of Western cultures would develop anti-Jewish attitudes, not always connected to religion, but often with some of the same core elements, which would snowball. That is to say, in a particular time and place, there might be a particular grudge against the Jews that might have to do with ethnic conflict or xenophobia, but they would sort of pick up on some of the same defamations that had been told a century before. I don't know. I would recommend Nuremberg or Wistrich on those issues.
It's not a religious question.
It's not that, it's just that we have a lot of questions and you've had a chance to do one, so I'm not gonna, I'm gonna ask your forgiveness.
I would like to expand on the anti-Zionist question earlier. First off, could you provide a definition of your view of Zionism? And then also, I feel as though in our current political world, there has been the use of equation of criticisms of Israel to delegitimize those criticisms. And then also there has been the use of support for Israel to kind of negate anti-Semitism. And my view of what happened last week during the inauguration was that Trump did a Nazi salute and seeing the ADL and other Jewish organizations and Jewish or members of the Jewish faith that I've talked to defending that. And I want to know your point of view on whether or not that is damaging potentially for using pro-Israeli sentiment to cover up anti-Semitism, if that is the case, and also whether or not it is also damaging for legitimate criticisms of Israel to be labeled as anti-Semitic.
I think one should speak the truth. So one shouldn't disguise one thing as another. Generally, I think you were referring perhaps to Elon Musk as opposed to Donald Trump. Yeah. And there are different approaches to that, and it's hard to say. He denies it, and then there are different pictures that we've seen of lots of lots of different liberal politicians doing things with their hand that look kind of similar. So I don't know why he was I don't know why he was doing that. I kind of side with the Anti-Defamation League about that. I guess we'll never know what the intention was for a particular gesture in a moment of enthusiasm. You ask about my definition of Zionism. So I probably could have a lot of different definitions of Zionism depending on the particular purpose, but to me what's important is that anti-Zionism is not of the sort that I'm discussing is not an opposition to Zionism as it actually exists, any more that anti-Semitism is an opposition to Jews as Jews really exist, which is to say, if you want to understand anti-Semitism, to me, you don't start with what is a Jew. You start with what are people saying and doing about Jews and why. How do they get there? And it's you're not going to do it by. There was a generation of scholarship, very early on, that tried to look at what does it mean to be Jewish, and is this true or false? What they say about Jews. But asking whether it's true or false is not the way to go about it. Instead, the way to go about it is to ask about a particular form of prejudice. Why does it develop? What is the work that it does culturally? Why is it that a particular individual or a particular people at a time is scapegoating an individual? To me, anti-Zionism is like that. That's different than criticism of Israel. There are people who criticize Israel for lots of different reasons. Nobody criticizes Israel more than Israelis, for example. So they're just criticizing Israel as one criticizes other countries is sort of a different thing. Anti-Zionism, as I use that term, is a distorted perception of Israel as the collective Jew, which is not an opposition to a particular ideology or approach.
There are a number of questions on the same vein from the virtual audience. I'm just going to ask one of they're about what one can do about this, but I'll ask one of them about specifically students who experience anti-Semitism on campus. The questioner asks, should they go to OCR first or just sue? But I'll invite you to answer that more broadly.
So they should go to brandeiscenter.com. Kind of making it funny, but you might have thought, yeah, that was a good thing to do, and that's fine also. And that's why we're here. The Louis D. Brandeis Center helps people who are asking those questions, and the answer is always going to be different. There are other options, by the way, besides file a federal complaint with the Department of Education or file a lawsuit, right? There's file a grievance within the university, which is sometimes the right thing to do and sometimes the wrong thing to do. There's address a situation in a different way. So there are lots of different approaches. Now, I guess I'll say a few words about why we would sometimes go to OCR versus why we would go to a court. Okay, so you know by now what I mean when we say OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which I headed during both the George W. Bush and Trump 1 terms. So when you go to OCR, you don't need a lawyer, and you don't need to spend a lot of time or money. You could even just go onto their computer system and just type in a complaint, and they might call you. Now, are you better off with a lawyer? Yeah, but you don't need one. And even if you have a lawyer or an organization, it doesn't require a lot of resources. You go into court, that takes a ton of resources. You're either finding a lawyer or paying a lawyer. If you're going up against a university, especially a big university, they're going to get big firms. Hundreds of $1,000s of legal fee go by in pretty quickly. That's a disadvantage of court. Now, you might have different sorts of claims. You might have, it matters. Were you physically assaulted? Maybe there's a criminal matter, and you should go to a prosecutor. Maybe there's a perpetrator who hit you or did something. You have different sorts of claims. Maybe there were several different ways in which you were harmed, and OCR can't deal with all of them. Now, one thing about court is you file that complaint in court, and you get to write the whole complaint, and you get to drive the case, which means you get to have novel legal theories. You get to tell the story the way you want to tell the story. You don't have a government official investigating, but that government official might be sort of a risk-averse government employee, not known for novel legal theories. So there are lots of different pros and cons. There might be a different statute of limitations depending on the state you're in. There will be different legal standards that may or may not matter and that might make a difference one way or the other. These are all reasons why it's worthwhile calling a lawyer organization that deals with it to find out, what are my odds or chances in one rather than the other.
Thank you.